Morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
10 minutes after 7 o'clock now this Wednesday morning, we're talking HR with HRMAB, and we're talking relationships really at the end of the day, the relationship between the employer and the employee, and somewhere intersected between that is that HR officer. Joining us as we take a look at this is Brittany Brathwaite, the immediate past president of HRMAB, and with her is Tanya Nichols, a senior HR professional. Good morning, ladies.
Good morning.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to talk about this because it is central to everything that we do within the workplace, that relationship. And oftentimes, either side of the relationship wants to assert its rights. And I want to start with you, Tanya, by looking at the Holiday with Pay Act in particular, because oftentimes so many people can get it so very wrong.
It is so true. And especially coming up for the public holidays that we have with the festival season, I think it's really important for employers to remember key things about the Holiday with Pay Act. For example, for crop over, Emancipation Day, as long as an employee has a vacation that spans those 2 days, you have to remember that those public holidays are not computed as a part of the employee's vacation. So some employers would give an extra day. Other employers, let's say your vacation was 10 days, including those public holidays, your vacation would be computed as 9 days. So automatically you get back the day. So it's important for employers to remember as it relates to public holidays during a person's vacation that they need not to compute that day.
Right. Don't treat it as though it is another holiday as part of the allotment of holiday days within a particular year. But it is a day that is dedicated and given to the employee, and it's their right to have it as an additional quote unquote off day. But sometimes that off day can have a value attached to it. And so there are people who are going to say, but hold on, it's a holiday for me, you have to pay me double time, and all those kinds of things. So let's talk a little bit about that and how sometimes we can get it so wrong.
Well, that is not the case. It's going to be computed based on their average pay. 350 seconds will still apply, or the 450 second, providing that the person has been employed for 5 years or more. So because it's a bank holiday in your vacation, you're not going to be getting double pay. Or as some places may pay for a particular bank holidays, triple pay. It will not be that.
A lot of employers are struggling with employees who are very good at looking at the calendar and saying, aha, look, we have one who's extended weekends. I am going to book my holiday there and I'll do it every time. And they can't tell me nothing. So, and employers sometimes find themselves then having to find people to fill in because of these additional days that this individual is going to be receiving. How does it, from an employer's perspective, how do we manage that situation?
So because Barbados is a very consultative and collaborative type of country, a lot of us get this wrong. So by law, it is really the employer's right to schedule vacation, right? Very often you have companies that will ask employees, when do you want to take holiday? And they would allow that. But the right really is at the employer to schedule the employee's holiday and to give you a minimum of 14 days notice of when you are going to be going off on holiday, right? Now for the companies that do allow employees to schedule their holiday, great. But making changes, there still needs to be a framework for that. So very often a company would have in their handbook or their collective agreement that if an employee wants to make changes to their holiday, that they need to, let's say, give a month's notice, right? And at the end of the day, your vacation is still to be approved by your manager. So if you decide I'm going to take my vacation around these extended weekends all the time, the business or the manager needs to identify whether that works for the company or not, and then approve it or decline it accordingly.
And then you get a sick out, right, Brittany? Then you get a sick out. Whereas somebody decides, you know what, I'm going to take matters into my own hands, certificate coming at you. But let's look at that, because a lot of times, Brittany, employees don't recognize that there's a cost to the company when there's that thing known either as certified or even uncertified sick leave.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that there's a cost to them.
Mm-hmm.
So, first, let's start by identifying that there's a legislative gap around certified and uncertified sick leave. So, there's nothing that mandates within the legislative framework that an employer must pay while you're on certified sick leave. And that's because, of course, we have a social security net, also known as the National Insurance Scheme.
Right.
Persons would be aware when they take certified sick leave, they can claim for a benefit through the national insurance scheme. And therefore, even in the absence of a legislative mandate around that, there is, of course, guidance that can be found in just about most employment agreements or collective agreements on how certified sick leave is treated to via the employer and what an employee can expect if they, take certified sick leave. So it's important for persons to refer to their employment agreements, refer to their collective agreements or their representative through the labor unions to understand how certified sick leave periods are treated, if there's a notice period that is expected around the submission of certified sick leave certificates. I'd say with the impending weekend, it's very important that persons remember, and this is again not within legislative framework, but it is custom and practice and embedded in many employment agreements. If you have 3 days where you are no show at work, and that's a very common term, or you just simply don't show without calling in, it can warrant termination of your employment agreement. So these little things are very important to note around certified sick leave as well as no shows. But there's also uncertified sick leave where a
Mm-hmm.
person may feel unwell. They
Yes.
get up in the morning and they have to call in and say, I'm not available to come in today. There is no legislative mandate that an employer has to pay you for those uncertified days either. So it's
Really?
really important. That's correct. So it's really important that you review your employment agreement or your collective agreement so that you are sure whether those days will in fact be paid days. Many employers have a cap on uncertified days. So
Mm-hmm.
the common thing is 6 uncertified days in an
Yes.
annual period. But again, not a legislative mandate if you function in the private sector. So please refer to your employment agreement or check in with your HR rep in your organization to understand the treatment of those periods.
So it almost puts the onus too back on the employee. You know, you decide whether or not you can afford this. You either can afford it or you can't afford it. So if you think you can afford to stay away, that's at you. But at the same time, Brittany, it puts the pressure on the employer because the job still needs to be done. And you need a human being to be able to do so. And you need there now to spend in bringing in a resource that you perhaps did not calculate for. Is that a fair view of it? Because there are some employers who hold that view that you're costing me, now I have to go and find somebody.
Yeah, absolutely fair view. I think particularly during festival periods, retail, wholesale, every type of industry usually sees a surge. So it can be tremendously onerous on an employer to have an uptake in their, consumers demanding their products and services. And then the persons who render those services within their organization, their team members, calling in with very late notice or, taking certified sick leave, etc. So it can be extremely onerous on specific employers and dependent on the industry. I do know there are some employers that have, smart workarounds and strategic workarounds around these things. So they may have casual pools of labor so
Mm-hmm.
that they can call persons in and rotate them in if they have last minute call-ins. Um, we're talking employee and employer rights. So if a person says they're on certified sick leave and they produce a certified sick leave certificate from a medical practitioner, that's something that an employer has to accept. I'd say from an employer perspective, if you see an unusual trend of a number of people, probably getting the same type of certified sick leave around the same
Yes.
time, you can, do a determination of fitness for the job. But that's another session for another day. But I would say it really comes down to managing the employment relationship here, and this is where our
Mm-hmm.
volunteeristic nature in Barbados becomes really important. Keep the communication channels between the teams open and let them know this period is really the period that we need you most.
You see, and that's why I framed it within the context of the relationship, because oftentimes it's when that relationship sours that you could find yourself having a situation on your hand where you are really between the rock and the hard place. And it's unfortunate, but we're human people, we're humans, and so we let our emotions sometimes take the better of us. But how do you, Brittany, as an HR practitioner, broach that conversation with the employee or with the organization in general that we have a problem in our hand of sick, either certified or uncertified sick leave?
Well, I mean, you really have to start broaching it by being able to track your metrics. So we may say or feel like as though we have an absenteeism problem, but if you're not tracking accurate metrics to determine whether it's impacting your bottom line or your productivity, then you're unsure as to whether what you're saying is a feeling or it's a fact. If you can prove it's a fact, then you really have to dig deep into your culture to ascertain what are the things that are driving absenteeism. Is it employee morale? Do we need to do more things to encourage and incentivize employees to understand that their presence is valued? Is it a matter of simply the season being around and people feeling as though they need to party? Can we create those cultural elements in the workplace? And you see lots of businesses doing that. They do work-up workouts, or they'll bring artists in. So
Yes.
finding very innovative ways to embed or to treat to the core issues that may be really creating the absenteeism causes. And I always use this analogy: don't treat to the icing, treat to the cake. You really need to look below the surface of what's causing the absenteeism, dig deep, and work with your leaders to creating a fix to those things.
You're quite right in finding a creative way to be able to fix to those things. And sometimes, you mentioned the workouts and the like, but when we do that, sometimes we forget that relationship between employer and employee. We let our guards down and oops, we've crossed the line of sexual harassment. That potential is very real. And given what we are now into the last laps of crop over, where people are going to get into costumes and get out there and behave differently, how do we ensure that the people who we employ, who we have to manage, don't find themselves in a situation where somebody can raise their hand and say, hold on, you sexually harassed me, and that was unfair to me? Tanya, what do you say we do? Tanya, what do you say we do?
Well, I think it's important. When the sexual harassment initially came out, all employers were required to put things in place so that all employees would be aware. But that needs to be a continuous process, especially in light of the crop over season or even staff parties, staff lines. I think it's important to just send little nuggets to your employees to help them to remember. At the end of the day, sexual harassment is really about how I interpret the action, right? Not your intention, because you may not have intended to be offensive to me, but if I received it that way, then I can very well make a complaint about sexual harassment. So I think it's important to just send little nuggets out to employees periodically, especially before these type of events, that they are mindful of their actions and that it is really about how that action is received by the person.
Brittany, context, is that also a critical part of it? Because all I said to you was that you look really nice. That's all I said. And isn't that the truth?
I think it's really important. So as Tanya, leaning on what Tanya said, sexual harassment really can be a very subjective thing. So this is where it becomes important that employers create frameworks so that persons are clear as to what is acceptable and not acceptable in this workplace. And if we can create those frameworks via policy, via nuggets of reminders and continuous guidelines. So if you're having an event, it's really important, and a work-related event that may not be at the workplace, but at a bar, send guidelines. Don't be afraid to send guidelines of what would be acceptable and appropriate behavior here, so that persons are clear. I think we sometimes can cause the ambiguity that leads to situations. And of course, there may be persons who, regardless of those guidelines or not, they will cross the line. But it helps that you continuously reiterate from a policy perspective, from an organization, this is what is acceptable or it's not. So if, for example, Pearson tells me I look nice this morning, and I choose not to like that, I could say to Pearson, I don't like that. And should there be a repeat of that offense, then Pearson has to be held accountable because in the first instance, there was no intention of harm, but it was shared with him on the second instance that that's not something that I would want said to me. So it's really important that those guidelines, the parameters, and the training is done in advance of the festival season. It's a bit late now, but it's good to have those reminders going out and some training done before festival season.
Can it be brought into bear when it comes to time and place? Because while it might not have been done here on my property on Kadooment Day, however, is that a different matter? Do we view it differently, or is that now a situation for the law to take care of?
Yes, well, the Act really refers to sexual harassment in the workplace.
Okay.
Right? So it contextualizes it in the work environment outside. And so, like Brittany mentioned, it might be a staff event at a bar. So that's still really, kind of the work environment. So, but crop over, jump up day, those types of things, then that will be outside of the context of work. So that would be for the legal courts and the law to deal with.
So the point is, what happens here stays here, so to speak. But nonetheless, it is legislated and it is determined by the organization. The organization determines the kind of behavior it sees acceptable or not. And the individual also has a right to be able to say, I find what you've done to me or said to me totally unacceptable, and I will not have its repetition, because if you do, I will now bring the charge against you. And so that kind of relationship is the one that we're talking about when we talk in this particular context today, that there's so much that we can get so right, and then there's so much we can get so wrong so easily by the way we treat the people that we work with and employ. It's a conversation that has to continue while we build out the sensitivity around our working and employment situations indeed. And so I want to thank both of you again for exciting me in this subject and for really teaching a lot of us as budding practitioners, because we're not unnecessarily HR practitioners, but we do manage people. And once we manage people, there's HR in all of that. And I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning, Brittany Brathwaite and Tanya Nichols from HRMAB. All the best.
Thank you.
Most welcome.
You are very welcome indeed.